Our presentation today is about identity as articulated by children and young people. We really like this image because you can see people's heads. You can you can see the backs of people's heads. But in looking at these heads, you can make assumptions about people's identity, about people's skin tones. The kinds of hats that they wear might also indicate whether they have particular beliefs, particular values that they hold through. The lady with the blue hat, um, she's either feeling hot or cold. I'm not quite sure. But when we see people, we make assumptions about them, about their age, about their ethnicity, about their beliefs. There's a lady here who's possibly wearing a brown hijab. There's a man in a turban. And what we want to do today is drill down, beyond these perceptions into how people understand themselves. And we're going to try our best to do that. We've got about 50 minutes. Let's see where we get to. Now, while talking about other people's identities, we also feel the need to talk about our own. So I'm going to hand over to Alison, who's going to start the process so that we can really be transparent about who we are.
Alison, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's really important that you understand our positionality, mainly because it informs what we call the epistemic approach. That is how we know what we know. And so what we're going to do now is just declare and be very transparent about the way we understand our identity. So I am, my background is I am a mother of 8. I am a practicing Mormon, and I'm obviously of white British descent. And that obviously informs the way I approach my research. And I identify as a woman. So I'm going to hand over to Kusha, who's going to sort of explain her positionality.
Thank you, Alison, and I follow your format as well. So I'm a mother of 1. I was born here. I'm from India, so I belong to South Asian heritage, married into a Sikh family. So I see multiple identities in my own household, but I identify myself as a photographer. I feel that my identity is in my photography and in my research. Now I'll hand over to Sarya.
So you know a little bit about me already because James stole my thunder. I'm a feminist sociologist of religion. I've done loads of work around interfaith relations, around faith as a purveyor of conflict, but also faith as part of the solution. When I say faith, I mean both religious and non-religious faith. But that's not why I'm here today. About a decade ago now, he's nearly 9, I applied to adopt my little boy. My social worker asked me, as you do, she asked me and my husband to read lots of stuff. I always fear one day she's going to be in the room when I'm saying this, but I didn't read anything she gave me and instead started reading all the papers and articles and whatnot. And I realized that there was a gap in understanding the identities of minoritized children in care. One thing, and so I've really come to this space here today because of my personal lived experience. I don't have social work training. In my team, Alison has some social work training, but she used to work in child protection. So we do also come here in humility. We've got a lot to learn from you. As much as we're delivering this session, we will also learn from you and what you tell us. So I started, I'm a hyperactive researcher sometimes, as colleagues know, and one thing led to another, and we got some funding from the Department for Education in partnership with Penny Appeal, in partnership with Quorum BAFS. Our relationship goes a long time. And we undertook what was the first ever research project to look at the experiences of Muslim heritage children in care. So we were really privileged to be first off the block. The Muslimness came because that is what the DFE wanted. We tweaked it slightly and said not Muslim children, but Muslim heritage children, because we wanted to acknowledge the complexity in what being a Muslim can mean for the children whom we work with. And we'll start unpicking some of those issues throughout this presentation. On the back of that project, we've delivered knowledge exchange workshops to over 600, 700 social workers now. We've lost count. And every time we deliver a workshop, we also learn from the colleagues we are speaking to. Lots of publications, practice guides from that work. And that kind of then led to the current project. And we're really going to be talking to you about this work. And this is funded by the Nuffield Foundation. Big shout out to them for trusting us, Mavericks. But this project, the Expressions of Self research project, sought to address a gap in our previous work. In our previous work, we had spoken to social workers, adopters, foster carers, prospective, foster carers, but we hadn't spoken to children and young people. And this current project has addressed that gap. We have now spoken to over 25 children and young people from Black, South Asian, mixed and other, minoritized backgrounds, and we have spoken to them about identity. I'm going to hand over to Alison, who will tell you why, we've wanted to do all of this.
Right. So here are we pulled together some of the current state of play, where we're at. And I think I'm going to draw attention to a couple of statistics. I like data. I'm particularly interested in what the stories that data tell us. And I think there's three things I want you to really reflect upon. You will notice that mixed or multiple ethnic groups, children who are in care are more likely to have 3 or more placements, and even more likely than Black or white British placements. And I think that's worth considering as we go through this conversation and perhaps interrogate why they have so many placements. I think the other important thing we look at, because I think this can challenge some of the unconscious bias we have. If you notice that the highest percentage in education, training and employment is Black care leavers. And I think that again is something that we need to reflect upon, that what is it that is facilitating this much higher uptake than in comparison to white children, that in my experience 21% is actually sounds pretty good engagement. And lastly, and probably the most important thing to consider, we know that Black and minority children wait longer for placements for many complex reasons. One of them being there isn't sufficient enough Muslim carers coming forward, challenges because they often tend to enter the care system later. And therefore, that in of itself presents a different set of problems. And so I think as we go through, I want you to bear in mind that these statistics tell ultimately that with minoritized groups, they are triply marginalized. It is not just that they come into care later, have more placements, but also there is less likely to have families that perhaps can offer them or reflect their cultural and ethnic positionality, their identity. So, and lastly, and we should flag this up, when we talk about religion, and you need to be really aware of this, there is no national recording of religious data for children. So we do not know the scale of the problem. And because we do not know the scale of the problem, there therefore isn't a national policy that addresses religion. There might be policies that addresses certain religions, but when it comes to religion as or even non-religion or any kind of faith belief, there isn't any definitive figures that we can actually state the scale. And I think that the data is only held by individual local authorities. So I'm going to hand back to Saria, who's now going to move on to our new research.
Thank you very much, Alison. And you know what, the census, the national census, this is not the looked after children census, the national census does indicate that when it comes to ethnic minority communities, religion is much more significant. 80% of ethnic minority communities have some sort of affiliation to religion. As you will see from our next project, what religion means for the children we spoke to varies dramatically. Nevertheless, we feel this nexus between religion and ethnicity when it comes to minoritized children is something that certainly needs to look at. We need to look at. The eagle-eared, not eagle-eyed among you will have also noticed that we oscillate between minorities, minoritized. In defining the group of people we work with, we prefer minoritized because it's a verb, it's not a noun. And that by that virtue, what we are hoping that the word does is encourage us to move away from sort of set in stone, essentialized ideas of these groups. And using minoritized also helps us to, think about how these groups are minoritized here, not because they are minorities, but they are minoritized because of wider social dynamics, power hierarchies, the local context that here in Britain positions these groups as minorities. But that's a bit of theory. Moving on then, I'm going to invite Kusha to tell us a little bit about the methodologies that we use. We're not going to go into details, but we want to give you a sense of our approach. Over to you, Kusha. Thank you.
Thank you, Saria. I'll say two things there. So the methods we used in the research funded by Nafeel were mainly around arts-based participatory methods. So we gave them ways to describe or to share their journey. So it was only open to them to share the ways or the tools that they want to share. And I think overall, it really helped in amplifying their voice and agency to share experiences and care. And they were incredibly useful in also collecting emotive experiences such as silence, gratitude, fear, anger, activism, and hope. And the second point I want to make is we as researchers also learned various other creative ways such as carpentry, interior design, photography, and others to learn about their journeys in care. And also these tools they shared with us also showed their understanding of their identity in care. I'll stop here, sorry.
Thank you, Kusha. So we're really interested in listening to children, and young people, and trying to get a sense of what really matters to them. From our previous work with Muslim heritage children, my slides. Yeah, there we go. From our previous work with Muslim heritage children, we began to gain insights into how children's understandings of identity, be it religious identity, ethnic identity, is very different from how as adults, understand religion and identity and ethnicity. For children, all the more, it's less institutional. By institution, we mean the texts of a faith, the politics of an ethnic position. It's less about all of that. It's less, if it came to Christian children, it was less about, the Bible and going to church. Although for some people that mattered, it was more about, what you did in church. A young Black man we spoke to said he loved going to church. And we said, why do you love going to church? And he said, it's because that's the only place where I'm treated as a human being and where I don't get any, racist behavior directed towards me. So he loved church, not necessarily because of the spirituality he gained there, but because of the fact that he was treated in a particular way that he valued. We really like this picture, this really fancy, beautiful lamp that you've got on your screens at the moment. I mean, when you look at the lamp, I think most of you would agree it indicates sort of Middle Eastern Islamic culture. There's nothing really quote unquote Islamic about it. Our sense of this lamp's Islamicness or Muslimness is because of the cultural architecture that has emerged around Islam that we perceive. And that culture, those cultural indicators, whether Islamic, whether Christian, or whether they emerge from ethnicity, food, religious behaviors, languages, that's really what children pick up. So we're going to spend a few minutes now, and this is really the heart of our presentation. How do children understand identity? Quick story, right? We've got many stories from our field work, but we're going to focus on one, right? We're going to focus on Alina's story. Alina is a young Pakistani heritage woman, girl. I won't tell you how old she is because I don't really want to give out, a full sense of who she is. You're masking identities on a variety of levels. So Alina was somebody I interviewed a couple of months ago now. Really articulate young woman. She did add, so she was really keen to talk to us about her identity. She came from a very practicing Muslim background. Um, she came into care when she was 8 or 9. She says when she was 11 or 12, she managed to organize with her social workers to take her for the lesser pilgrimage. She accompanied her foster carers and she made pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And there she says she stood in the holy mosque. That is, the heart of the pilgrimage. She held the Kaaba, which some of you will have seen as the black square. Muslims, we point to that direction all over the world while we are praying. We believe that that has connections to Adam, to Abraham. So that is a place of great spirituality. And she said she stood there in the holy mosque, held the Kaaba, and wept because she was so moved by her spiritual experience. And she felt that at that point, despite being in care, she felt in love. She felt loved. She had foster carers who cared for her. She had God on her side. Now, when I spoke to her, this was a year on, and when I spoke to her, she said she was no longer religious. Islam no longer mattered to her. She said that at that point, I said, what do you describe your identity as? What is important to you? She said, and at young teenagers, she said, makeup is really important. Football is really important. And I was like, whoa, okay. Religion was no longer important, although she said every time she saw her parents, her biological parents, she felt a small connection to her religiosity. I said, is religion out then? And she says, no, religion is not out. I don't want it to be out because who knows? A few years later, I might want to go back to it. I said, what about makeup then? When she said, oh, that's changing as well. I went through a phase, she says to me, a few years ago when I used to use she described the term as pancake makeup. She said, I wanted to change my skin tone. I wanted to change my hair. She had lovely curly hair. I wanted to straighten it. I was not being myself. And she says, now I use very light makeup because I'm quite happy for the makeup not to overpower who I am. We then spoke about football, and she said, there is a football team next to me, the street next to me, but I trek halfway across town, take 2 buses to in 45 minutes to get to this team because it's an all-girls team. Why am I telling you Alina's story? Why did we as a team, me and Alison, decide to tell you Alina's story? Because we wanted to show you how Islam is really different. It can mean deep religiosity. Alina says when she lived with her biological family, all she had was religion. There was nothing else in her family. The only music she listened to was religious music. Coming into foster care, she had access to different ways of being Muslim in ways that was, not religious at all, to being Muslim ways that were deeply religious. And she was finding her way. So that was one reason we wanted to tell you this story. We wanted to talk about the football bit. Alina has rejected Islam at the moment, at least temporarily, but she still found a football team that catered to her understandings of gender norms. She wanted an all-woman team. And we also want to talk about the makeup and see how it isn't just Islam and her attitudes to Islam that changed, but her attitudes to makeup changed also in allowing to show and not show herself. And so let's, using Alina's story, and there are many other stories that we could use as we talk about this. We just wanted to talk a little bit more about children's identities. Now, can people in the screen humor me? The food that you can see, what culture does that indicate to you? I'm giving you 30 seconds to put your answers in the chat. Which culture do you think that food comes from? I won't talk if you don't put that in the chat. So Lebanese, okie dokie, Turkish, Middle Eastern, possibly Turkish, Middle Eastern, very good. Turkish, Pakistani, excellent. All of you are pretty much in the same Turkish. Thank you, Catherine. Middle Eastern. Can we say general consensus? Indian. Tabish, you're breaking Malaysian. Oh my God. Okay. North Africa. All right. Okay. Okay. So general consensus, Middle Eastern, North African, well, some Malaysian and some Indian and some Pakistani. I mean, no right answers, wrong answers. But the point I was trying to make, when you saw that image, you could make pretty accurate, you could frame a pretty accurate understanding of where that food was coming from. And again, markers of cultural identity, markers indeed of religious identity as well. They're not just the text, they're not just the scriptures, they're not just the places of worship. It's not just my hijab. It's all sorts of things. And that is really what we find matters to children. Now, screen, please share. If I talk to it, it works. Now, the first aspect of children's led and intersectional, the first aspect of trying to understand children's identities is this idea of layers, of intersections. Intersectionality is a feminist term that emerged in the 80s. Black feminists wrote about it, and they said, women's experiences of identity and of feminism are also impacted by their ethnicity. So if you are a Black woman, your experience of feminism is going to be very different from a white woman's experience of feminism. We think that is really useful in understanding children in cares, their identities, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's gender, whether it's age, all of this can come together. A younger child, for example, will have a very different sense, if any, of what religion means to them, or of what identity, ethnicity means to them, especially if they've come into care, when they were babies or very, very young. As they get older, their sense of identity gets more consolidated. We spoke to a young man who came into care because of his, well, largely because of what he defined as a disability. He used to get severe fits, which meant he couldn't work. The fact that he couldn't work was not taken kindly within his family, where young men went to say, by the time a young lad was 15 or 16 or younger than that, he was expected to take on informal work. He couldn't work because every time he got a job, he'd get a fit. His family didn't take that kindly. They didn't treat him very well. He didn't tell me how. He came into care. When describing his identity, he spoke about his ethnicity being at the top and his beliefs being at the top. But if we look at his interview, 70% of his interview was about his disability and how it hampers his work. The pebbles that you can see, the rock statues that we make on the beach, there are layers to it. There's a hierarchy to it. Bigger rocks at the bottom, bigger pebbles at the bottom. The smaller, less important aspects of your identity are sort of fitted into the structure as well. So identity is the sum of parts. Moving and oscillating and changing identities. You saw with Elena, deeply Muslim one day, not Muslim another day, does not want to reject Islam completely. This can be shaped by carers' identities. This can be shaped by wanting to fit in. Me and Alison tells the story, don't you, Alison, of the woman, the young girl with the hijab. Do you want to say it quickly?
Yeah, a social worker told us a story of a young girl who had a hijab who was placed in with a white family in a very white area. And within 3 weeks, she'd removed the hijab. So when she went to a panel, they assumed that it was a sign of her being empowered rather than interrogate why she had removed her hijab. And I think that, again, and when it was examined more deeply, it was able to see that she saw it as a way of fitting in. And that drew questions about how they accommodated her, her religious identity.
Thank you very much, Alison. I'm going back to Alina, right? I asked Alina, what would you like us to tell social workers and other practitioners who are working with children in care? What do you want me to tell them about identity? I mean, Alina was keen to get the interview done, and she wanted to talk to me about makeup, but I'm not very good with talking about makeup. So I said, let's go back to identity, and she did give me some tips. Anyway, that's by the by. Coming back to identity, what Alina did say is, what I want you to tell social workers is, she told me her age, and I'm going to say she was 15. I am 15. I am still finding out who I am. I am still developing a sense of what my identity is. And so give me space to find who I want to be. And I thought that was quite profound. We then had this sense of identities that young people were determining for themselves. Kusha, do you want to jump in, please, and tell us the story of the artist you spoke to?
Yes, so I spoke to a young man who was adopted by his aunt in the UK. Originally, he was born into the Indian family, belonged to a low socioeconomic status. So because of the financial constraint, he was adopted by his aunt in the UK. So when I asked him about his identity, he said, I'm an artist. And he also revealed that his hobby is art, to be, his future is to become an artist. But what was interesting was in his story that he said art served as a powerful tool to express his deepest thoughts and emotions associated with his experiences in care. So he would go to a studio, he would draw, and then he would destroy. So I asked him, why would you destroy it? And he said, I don't want people to see it. I don't want people to look at my journey or look at my creations. Quoting him, he said, I don't want people to know my journey in art. I don't want to change the world. I'm not an activist. I'm just a child in care whose best friend is the art.
Thank you, Kusha. That's brilliant. And so these identities were often negotiated. As children tried to make sense of who they were, their biological families, their foster families, or their adoptive families, their networks, their friend circles. These are very nuanced. I interviewed more recently and it's so complicated. She was a young girl of Indian heritage, a young adult of Indian heritage who was adopted as a baby. She was found, she doesn't know much at all about how she ended up in an orphanage in India. I suspect, there was deprivation. Her parents couldn't cope. Her biological parents, I suspect, also she would have been of a lower caste, Indian Hindu potentially. But she knows nothing. She knows nothing other than she was found in an orphanage. She doesn't even know whether she was abandoned or somebody gave her up. But she was adopted by a white couple who took her, who loved her unconditionally, who took her back to their town where she was the only brown person in her entire town. Her parents loved her unconditionally, right? They still love her and she loves them. She recently got married. Her adopted dad gave her away. But she says she hates her skin tone. I saw she tweets about hating her skin tone. She dresses up in Indian clothes and puts pictures up on social media and says, I wish I could come to love my own skin. She experienced a lot of racism, a lot of xenophobia while in school. and through university that has led her to have enduring mental health issues. Her parents supported her as much as they could, but she also made the comment that, if you're not living through it, you don't 100% understand it. And I asked her, what is your idea? And she is now practicing Christian because her parents are Christian and she loves, she's a very good Christian, if I may say so. I'm not, I don't really think I have the right to say that, but, practicing, goes to church regularly. When she was younger, she says it was a more spiritual Christianity. She says now she actually goes to church a lot more now, although she also recognizes that may well have not been the faith she was born in, but she doesn't know. So I asked her, what is your identity? She said, it's not really ethnic. She disregarded ethnicity because she's having to make sense of who she is. Is she white? Is she brown? She doesn't know. It's not religion. She said, my identity is family. Said, what do you mean? She said, no, that is that. My identity is family with all its complexities. As an academic, I did a little dance because I thought that was extremely profound. But it also a simple way of explaining away all the complex negotiations that she has to have with herself. It is empowering, just as the art, Kush's young man, his art was empowering. And we over and over again, Alina's football was empowering to her, as was her makeup. And we found young people asserting, different ways of articulating who they were. Sometimes these ways included religious and ethnic markers. Sometimes it didn't, and sometimes it included more than one different thing. And I know previously when I showed you the picture of the layers, I said identity is the sum of its parts. But I think when we looked at these self-determined identities, it was much more than the sum of its parts. So we brought all of these three ideas together. Turn your faces away. I love this seesaw, but it makes me dizzy, right? But I love it, so I'm going to keep it. But turn your faces if you feel dizzy or giddy. And I'll move away as quickly as I can from the seesaw. Now, the reason I have, we've come up with this idea of identities that are in flux, that are changing, that are the sum of their different parts, that acknowledge the socio-ethnic, religious context of birth families, of, the experience of these children and young people's experiences in care. We talk about influx identities as a theoretical space, a practice space within which minoritized children, can be understood on their own terms. We're often asked, can you do a session on religious literacy? Or can you do a session on what Blackness means? And we're like, no, we want to do that because if you are to understand what religion or ethnic or any other form of identity means, you've got to talk to each child and understand it on their own terms. We use Crenshaw's intersectionality, which I spoke to you about previously. We also use McGuire, who I haven't spoken about, and McGuire's understandings of lived religion. Basically, what McGuire says, move away from these institutions, look at religion that is as it is lived, look at the negotiations. You might be Christian and go to church once in your lifetime or twice in your lifetime. You might be Muslim and go to the mosque maybe twice a year for the 2 Eids, or you might live right next to the mosque and go every single day. But if you are to meet children's whole needs, and if we are to do what is the best for children, we've really got to understand these categories on their own terms. And so identities change, right? They oscillate between different positionalities, between a Black child who washes their skin all the time because they want to look like their adoptive white family, or a Black child who had no sense of their Blackness, who thought Blackness didn't matter, who thought Blackness was overrated till they were 21 and attended a social do in Hackney and for the first time encountered what Black culture meant. Now, when we were preparing this slide, we thought about, is it a pendulum? Is it pendulous identities? We preferred a seesaw because seesaws are about children. I sit on a seesaw as well. I love sitting on seesaws, but that's not usual practice, is it? But it's also that the weight of the child or the young person or the older person who's sitting on the seesaw determines the movement of that seesaw, which is very different. Pendulums just do their own thing. Seesaws are led by the people who drive them, sit on them. And so these identities are really driven by, yeah, the young people who are living these identities. What does this mean for practice? And we are back to that beautiful colored lamp. Alison, this one's yours.
So what we've realized, having conversed with over a period of time delivering these trainings, we've nigh on almost 600-700 social workers, and the feedback we've had is we've realized that what we should be looking for is this curiosity, and this idea of a curious social worker is not new. But what we're trying to move away from is a rigid understanding, so that you become much more able to ask probing questions, be willing to enter uncomfortable spaces. And this means much more dialogue with the children, but also, and we are complicating your work, that you do not go every time expecting to see the same decision-making that you saw previous times, because of this idea of an influx identity. The second thing we believe that would help you become this curious social worker is to think about your own lived experiences, how you can empathize. One of the interesting things, religion is exceptionally good at creating rituals. When you think about Christmas, when you think about Ramadan, it's a very good way for people to feel a affinity with others. But what if these young people don't have good memories of those experiences? What if they've never experienced a holiday or a celebration that has been positive? So how do you create those memories? How do you allow them? Think about how you would feel if you hadn't had those Christmas experiences or those birthdays or experiences that are a celebration of your life. And lastly, we think curiosity is about understanding religion as lived as informs the decision making around what you eat, how you dress, how you think. But religious in everyday practices tends to be what we call pick and mix. Most people who have some kind of identity will pick the aspects, and they will either justify it or they will mold religious teachings into a way that they think can be lived. You cannot presuppose any religion is homogeneous. The doctrine, the theology may tell you that, but in reality doesn't. And you lastly need to interrogate your own biases about religion. To draw upon my own biography, my daughter is training as a social worker now. And one of the things she was told in her very first lectures was that they were about religion was it was spoke about in very negative terms. And again, we have to be very careful that we don't allow our biases about religious practices to colour our judgment, but equally we should interrogate practices that are detrimental to the well-being of the child, or oppose any kind of protection of characteristics. So it is about being brave, and sometimes maybe asking just putting yourself in uncomfortable spaces. So we are complicating it for you, but we hopefully it will give you the confidence to do so. I'm going to hand back to Sari, because we're now going to apply that principle in practice.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Alison. And as usual, my slides. There. We ask you to be curious. We ask you to be the curious social worker. That is our story. We've got a few slides later on that bring all of this together. But what we want you to do now, we've got 2 case studies here on our screen. These case studies are really, really bitty. Okay, we've got a young Christian man of African heritage. He told us how he used to go to church every day in a country in Africa. He prayed to God. He's come here now as an Orthodox Christian. He has really, really struggled to fit in within British Christian communities, and despite speaking English, he felt excluded from English language church services. And he was struggling on many, many different fronts. We are not telling you, there is a very happy ending to that story, but we've not put it in here because we want you to think about it. What would you do to support this child's identities? Identity, apologies for the typo. Case study 2 is about Ali, who was an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child who came here from Afghanistan, soft-spoken, well-mannered, seemed to have come from a very nice family. And he did say they actually saved up lots of their money and sent him to Europe to give him a better chance, a better chance at life in Europe, but also to help his family, because often people come here, the young people want to work and send back money to wherever their families are. Anyway, he was placed with a foster carer, in foster care with a highly experienced family, family who had a brilliant track record. Tom, Mary, Bill, their son, and Butch the dog. Ali was running away regularly from this foster home. The social worker is perplexed. And so we've not given you a lot of detail. What kinds of questions should the social worker be asking? I'm going to hand over to James. So I hope you found that exercise useful. We'd be very grateful if in the chat box you can, put down your thoughts. So, what were the things you discussed? What do you think really, what would you do to support the Christian man, a young Christian man of African heritage, if that is the case that you discussed? And if you discussed Ali's story, what are the questions that you think the social worker should be asking, will be asking? There are no right or wrong answers. So please feel free. Don't be scared that we're going to catch you out. It's just really about, and Caroline, thank you. You said you use case study 2. What is he finding difficult or uncomfortable? His understanding of Europe, case study 1. This was Rachel. Thank you for putting it all in. What does he not like? Yes, brilliant. Does this meet his identity currently? Okay, one new message. It would be good to look at his social graces. Absolutely, Alana. I mean, social graces is something that we use in tandem with intersectionality. So, it's overlaps between ethnicity, between religion, between lingual proficiency. What language do you speak? So in Ali's case, in addition to everything else, there is this burden of knowing that his parents have spent. So I think all of you are in the right track. And then we have this, how does he feel about Bill, another young man who is, in similar age to him? So it could be lots and lots of things. And I think everything that you have put in there is correct. In both cases, though, in the real life cases, the cases that we picked up, both of them had really, in the end, simple, small solutions. The young Christian man of African heritage, what his social worker did was she found him a Bible in his own language. She found it on the internet, she gave it to him, and that small, on the one level a gesture, on another level meeting this child's need at a very deeply profound inherent in terms of the identity, something that was really, really inherent to them, and meeting his needs in that way. So there was a step change in this young man's life, in his identity, in how in his behavior, and he started engaging. He felt welcome, he felt safe. In the case of Ali, the reason he was running away, which could have been all of that. He wanted to find employment. He was not getting the language. He couldn't get on with Bill. It could have been all of that. In this particular case, it was poor Butch the dog. Ali came from, many Muslim cultures don't like dogs. Dogs are seen as unclean. And because Ali came from a background where Islam was sort of important, we're not sure whether or not he prayed, but he couldn't deal with his perceptions of something that was unclean. And he ran away because he simply wanted to get away from Butch. I mean, Butch was really sweet. It wasn't Butch's fault at all. But I think it indicates how religious identities and ethnic identities confuse an impact upon lives in a way that you otherwise easily, would not pick up. So to bring our presentation to an end, in caring for, in providing for these multiple layered identities that are in a state of flux, we've got 3 points for practice. Very basic points, and I'm only going to read them out. So we encourage in your own practice, if you manage a team, in your team's practice, if you manage an organization, your organizational ethos, we encourage frames of reference that see religious, cultural, ethnic identity as a broad spectrum of engagement. So from the young person for whom ethnicity, their race, or maybe their faith is the be all and the front all of their identity, straight through to the person for whom this identity doesn't matter, who's decided the only identity that matters is my artistry or my poetry or my literature. And also to think about and to encourage that diversity. Do not be led by essentialized forms of identity. Secondly, we encourage you to think about identity in ways that move away from rigid understandings of ethnicity, of religion, and towards a more fluid sense of identities in flux. Remember Alina and her desire, to exit Islam now, but not to lose sight of it, and her call and her plea to all of us to give her space. To think also about the young Indian woman I mentioned, who was likely to have been from a Hindu background, who was adopted as a baby, who has no sense of her ethnic or religious identity. On the one level, she was brought up as a little white girl and so struggles with her skin tone. And she's deeply, deeply Christian while knowing that prior to adoption, she was possibly Hindu. So thinking about this when we make decisions around matching both in foster and adoptive placements. And practice, that is our third point, practice cultural humility, where us as practitioners learn from young people, learn from children about what everyday cultural, ethnic, religious norms mean to them. On that note, we're at the end of our presentation. In terms of next steps, we do have a longer session with Khorram Bah. We think it's on the 5th of October, or at least I think. I'm a bit dopey most times. We're having a big multi-faith information event for faith leaders that will be October, November sometime, but you're very welcome to, once we spread the message, to get your local communities to become involved in that. There will be a big launch for our detailed publications and a frontline practice guide. That's happening 7th of December, hopefully. If none of us go AWOL, I'd like to go to the seaside. There will be open access sessions, and we are starting a new project where we want to interview Black social workers and collect their oral histories. Because every time we've done a workshop like this, and where we've had more time and where we've had time to speak to social workers, if they have come from a minoritized identity, they tell us they either become the fount of all knowledge for their organization when it comes to things Black or brown or minoritized, or, and this happens too, they're sometimes branded troublemakers because they're asking too many questions about identity. Anyway, we want to make sense of that with our next project. So Alison, Kusha, and me, we hope you found that useful. We're very grateful to James and Liam and Khorram Bah for inviting us to do this. We are very grateful to you for having spent your lunchtime hour listening to us carry on. But we encourage you to watch this space. And if we can ever help you with your ruminations around identity, please do get in touch. We would be very, very happy to help. On that note, I hand back to James because I think we have some time for questions, some time for comments, chat or unmute yourself. Actually, I leave that to James. He'll know. But thank you very much. Our email addresses are on the screen. We've missed out Kusha's. Kusha, can you type your email address quickly?
Yeah, I'll do it now.
I have it.